Good morning, guys. Mr. Hunter here. We are on our second day of reading Who Was Frederick Douglass here. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We're going to jump right into chapter 1. The other day we read the introduction, but today we're going to jump into chapter 1. It's called A Young Slave. Before we start to read, we've been learning a few sign language facts. So if we're going to read, you're going to hold your hand like this, flat. Then you're going to take your other two hands, two fingers, and you're going to go read. So you're taking them down? Read. Everybody see that? Read. That's how you say read in sign language. So we hold it up again. We are going to read. I think I'm blocking the camera. Let me do it like this. Everybody, that's better? There you go. Read. Two fingers. Read. All right. Chapter 1, A Young Slave. The man who became famous as Frederick Douglass was born in a log hut on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1818. His name at birth was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. Frederick's mother, Harriet, was also a slave, which meant Frederick was a slave too. And they were owned by a man named Aaron Anthony. The slaves called him Captain Anthony or Old Master. Who was Frederick's father? It may have been Captain Anthony, but Frederick never knew for sure. Captain Anthony owned 3 farms and about 30 slaves. He also managed the farms of a very rich man named Edward Lloyd. The Lloyd family owned 13 farms and more than 500 slaves. Wow, that's a lot of slaves. Captain Anthony lived on the Lloyd's main farm, the White House plantation. Some of Captain Anthony's slaves lived there with him. Others, including members of Frederick's family, were spread out across other farms. So we're looking at the pictures there. That's where Frederick Douglass was. And then you see that's where the slaves were working in the fields out there if you look at your pictures, all right? You know what time it is? Turn the page. Frederick's mother, Harriet, worked long hours in Captain Anthony's fields or in those of a neighbor who rented her. It's crazy that people could be rented, like you rent a movie or something else. It's really not right, but that's how it was back then, all right? She was rented by a neighbor. Frederick saw his mother only 4 or 5 times in his entire life. Instead, he lived with his grandparents, Isaac and Betsy Bailey. Isaac was a free black man, but Betsy was a slave, and her job was to care for many young grandchildren until they were old enough to work. I would say she had a pretty important job, right? Yeah. Looking at the next page, who's that in the picture? Is that young Frederick? Anybody know what he's doing? Let's find out. Frederick's early years were happy ones. For a time, he knew little bit of slavery. He knew very little of slavery. He enjoyed fishing in the nearby stream and watching squirrels scamper about. So if you said he was fishing, you were right. Scamper about. I lost my place. Sorry. His grandparents' windowless cabin with its clay floor and dirt and straw chimney was small and rough. But to Frederick, it held the attractions of a palace. So he used his imagination. It didn't matter that he lived in a small place. It wasn't big. It wasn't really nice. To him, to Frederick, it was amazing. All right, let's turn the page. Then one day, Betsy brought him to work at Captain Anthony's. I'm going to say that sentence again. Then one day, Betsy brought him to work at Captain Anthony's. Betsy kept the reason for the journey a secret so as not to upset young Frederick. It was a 12-mile walk. So his strong grandmother had to carry Frederick on her shoulders every now and then. You mean I've driven 12 miles before, and that's a long way, but they had to walk 12 miles? How long do you think it took them having to walk 12 miles? A long time, all right? In the heat of the afternoon, they finally arrived at the grandest building Frederick had ever seen. White House was white with stately pillars and a neatly trimmed lawn. The plantation sat on the Wye River. Maybe that's why they called it the White House. It sat on the Wye River and was like its own little village with barns, stables, kitchens, blacksmiths, and shoemaker shops, and more. Captain Anthony lived in a separate house on the property. Look at that. Look how amazing that looks. That looks really big. But guess what? Even though it looked amazing, was it amazing for the slaves? No, it wasn't. It was probably a bad place for them to be or to even see. But let's turn the page. Let's read this part right here. Slavery in America. Slavery had been part of American history since early colonial days. The first black people, were kidnapped from their homelands in West Africa and brought to Virginia by ship in 1619. The slave trade continued for almost 200 years until it was outlawed in 1808. Wow, that's a really long time. No new slaves could be bought into the country after this time, but existing slaves who had children, I read that wrong, I'm sorry. No new slaves could be brought into the country after this time, but existing slaves who already had children. And then by the year 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the southern states, where large wheat and cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice plantations depended on slave labor. In the north, where farms were smaller, slavery was not as common or as profitable. For this and for other reasons, slavery in the north died out. Wow, I want to tell you guys something. There was a college that I went to. It was called Hampton University. It's a college that's called a historically black college and university, HBCU. By my college is an actual place where there's a lot of water. And that was actually the first place that slaves were brought. So where I went to college at was the first place where slaves were brought. They have a big sign. There's a museum there. It's really powerful. And when you grow up, maybe you can get a chance to go visit the museum down there and see it. Or there's a big museum in Washington, D.C. that your parents would love to take you to, and it's really awesome. So we'll talk more about that when we see each other soon in history. All right, let's look at the next page, page 11. Rowdy slave children surrounded Frederick when he arrived at the White House. Remember, he just got to the White House with his grandmother. Frederick's grandmother introduced him to his brother and his 2 sisters, whom he'd never met. Betsy encouraged Frederick to play with the children. So I think he's doing pretty well there. He's playing with them very nicely. And those are the ships that the slaves were brought over on. And it was a lot of slaves. They didn't have a lot of room, so they just put them in there. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't fun. And some slaves even died. All right, let's turn the page. All right, what was the last part we read? Frederick finally got to play with the children, and he finally reluctantly joined them. So he didn't want to play at first, but after a while he did. Sometime later, one of them ran up and hollered, "Fed, Fed, Grandmammy gone." So they didn't even know how to say his name properly. They said Fed. But his grandmother was gone. Frederick raced to the kitchen to see for himself. Betsy was indeed gone. For good. Almost heartbroken at the discovery, Frederick later wrote, "I fell upon the ground and wept a boy's bitter tears." It was the first time he experienced the cruelty of slavery. That's not a good feeling. If that's the only person that he knew and she left, it's really upsetting. And he was probably hurt as a little boy. I know I would be hurt if I was a little boy and my mom left or my grandmother left me. Looking at the next page. One morning soon after, Frederick was sleeping in a rough kitchen closet. Suddenly, he woke to the terrible shrieks of his Aunt Hester. Old Master was whipping Hester for spending time with her boyfriend, and Frederick watched through the cracks in the closet door. He never forgot the horrific scene, and from that day on, Frederick hated slavery with all his heart and soul. Turn the page. Because Frederick was still too young to work in the fields, he ran errands. He looked after the cows and chickens, and he kept the front yard clean. It wasn't hard work, not anything like hoeing or planting or weeding and harvesting crops from sunup to sundown. He wasn't often whipped or beaten, but he was cold and hungry. In hottest summer and coldest winter, Frederick remembered, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on but a coarse tow linen shirt, reaching only to my knees. Frederick slept on the dirt floor of the kitchen closet, without a bed, without a blanket. On the coldest nights, he'd climb inside a corn sack to try to keep warm. Turn the page. The hunger for Frederick was even worse. Aunt Katie was a cold-hearted slave who looked after the slave children. Does that sound like she was nice? No. She served cornmeal mush in a long trough placed on the ground. The strongest children got the most food, but even that wasn't enough, or that wasn't much. And sometimes Frederick's belly was so empty, he fought the dog for crumbs that fell from the table where Aunt Katie prepared food for Captain Anthony's family. Look at that. They're eating off on the ground in sort of like a wood bowl. Does that look like it would taste good or it's fun or anything? No. That means we should be thankful for the food and the place that we get to have, the beds that we get to sleep in, and the houses that we get to stay in, because this doesn't sound like it was a good time. But Frederick made it through, and we're going to find out more. All right? One day, Aunt Katie made Frederick go to the whole day without food. Did you hear that? Said one day Aunt Katie made Frederick go the whole day without food. Can you imagine going a whole day without food? I know I can't. That night, he quietly plucked a few grains from an ear of Indian corn. He was roasting the grains by the fire when his mother appeared on one of her few visits. Harriet was furious when she learned that her son had not eaten. She gave Aunt Katie a fiery lecture and replaced Frederick's corn with a heart-shaped ginger cake. In the cake of his mother, or in the care of his mother, Frederick felt like a king. But when morning came, his mother was gone, and he never saw her again. Harriet died shortly thereafter, though no one bothered to tell Frederick until sometime later. Thankfully, better days were ahead. Wow, that was a lot to read in chapter one, but it seems like we learned a little bit more about Frederick Douglass and how his life began. Did he have a really nice beginning? No, he didn't have his parents. He lived with his grandmother, and then even his grandmother left. He had to move and he had to walk 12 miles. He was enduring slavery. He didn't eat. He didn't have a place to sleep. He slept in a closet. Can you imagine that? Well, guess what, guys? There are still some people today that don't have as much as we have. They have really bad situations. There's even some people that you know about, like homeless people who don't get to sleep in beds or have homes to go home to. So we're going to keep praying for them. We pray for Frederick. We know he made it through, but we're going to find out more in chapter 2 when we read tomorrow.